Hello everyone, and welcome to the Fictional Vortex. So we are back with an interesting movie on what if Naruto was the primordial sage who founded Orario, Naruto x Freya x Hestia, DanMachi. But before we start, I just want to remind you to please subscribe to my channel and hit the like button if you enjoy my content. Let's start the story. Chapter 1. The Forgotten Sage. Golden autumn light spilled across ancient stone as dawn broke over Orario. The massive wall encircling the city cast long shadows, but none darker than those lurking within the mind of the solitary figure perched atop an abandoned watchtower on the city's forgotten eastern edge. His vibrant blue eyes, unchanged by the countless seasons they had witnessed, surveyed the awakening metropolis with detached curiosity. Naruto Uzumaki breathed deeply, drawing in the crisp morning air. Centuries had passed since he'd walked openly among the city's bustling streets, preferring instead the quiet solitude of his modest dwelling nestled against the outer wall. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had once craved acknowledgement above all else now deliberately faded into obscurity. "Another day in paradise," he murmured, his voice carrying the slight rasp of disuse. His fingers absently traced the faded whisker marks on his cheeks, permanent reminders of a world and a life that existed only in his memories. The Babel Tower dominated Orario's skyline, its impossible height stretching toward the heavens, a fitting monument to the hubris of gods who had descended to play among mortals. Naruto's lips curved into a sardonic smile. He had watched that tower rise stone by stone, had known its purpose before the first foundation was laid. He stretched languidly, his simple attire of loose black pants and an orange-trimmed coat catching the morning breeze. The coat's high collar concealed the lower half of his face when desired, a habit borrowed from an old teacher in another lifetime. His unruly blonde hair had grown longer over the years, now loosely tied at his nape in a style that would have amused his godfather. A flicker of movement drew his attention to the western gate. Even at this distance, his enhanced senses could distinguish the chattering adventurers embarking on their daily dungeon expeditions. Young, eager, dreams of glory shining in their eyes, so familiar it made his chest ache with nostalgia. Not my problem anymore, he reminded himself firmly, turning away from the view. The interior of the watchtower had been transformed into a Spartan living space. Scrolls lined simple wooden shelves, their parchment yellowed with age. Weapons of various designs hung on the walls, not for display but for practical use. A worn table held open books, careful notes penned in multiple languages documenting observations spanning centuries. Naruto moved to his meditation alcove, settling cross-legged on a worn cushion. Chakra flowed through his pathways, as vibrant and responsive as ever. Unlike the fauna-blessed adventurers of Orario, his power came from within, a remnant of his original world, adapted and evolved through countless experiments in this new reality. His eyes drifted closed. Daily meditation had become necessary over the long years, a way to organize the overwhelming accumulation of memories, to maintain his sense of self despite the crushing weight of immortality. The morning ritual centered him, allowed him to catalog the previous day's observations and prepare for. The floor beneath him trembled. Naruto's eyes snapped open, pupils narrowing to slits as he extended his senses. The vibration wasn't natural. He'd felt similar disturbances twice before over the centuries, and neither instance had ended well for Orario. Another tremor, stronger this time. In the city below, few would notice, perhaps attributing it to a passing cart or distant construction. But Naruto knew better. "So much for staying uninvolved," he muttered, rising fluidly to his feet. He crossed to a seemingly solid wall and pressed his palm against a specific stone. Intricate seals, invisible to normal sight, flared briefly with chakra before the wall dissolved, revealing a hidden chamber. Within lay artifacts collected across millennia, weapons of lost civilizations, tomes of forgotten knowledge, and items of personal significance preserved against time's ravages. From a lacquered box, Naruto withdrew a necklace bearing a simple crystal. The first Hokage's necklace, or a perfect replica he'd created from memory, molecules arranged exactly as the original had been. He slipped it over his head, the familiar weight settling against his chest. Just a precaution, he told the empty room, though the tension in his shoulders betrayed his unease. A third tremor shook the tower, rattling the shelves. This one would have been noticeable even to ordinary citizens. Naruto moved to the window, narrowing his eyes at the distant Babel Tower. Something was wrong. Not on the surface, but far below in the dungeon depths. The seal was weakening. With practiced efficiency, Naruto gathered essentials into a small pack. A compartment in the floor yielded specialized weapons. Kunai inscribed with complex sealing formulas, shuriken crafted from rare metals mined from the dungeon's deepest levels, and a scroll containing emergency supplies. He hesitated before a dusty shelf holding a single item, a scratched metal plate attached to a tattered cloth headband. The stylized leaf symbol remained visible despite the centuries. His fingers hovered over it momentarily before withdrawing. "Not today," he whispered. Some memories were best left undisturbed. Naruto stepped to the tower's open window, allowing himself one final survey of the peak. EFUL morning, likely the last tranquil moment before chaos erupted. The sun had fully crested the horizon now, bathing Orario in warm light that belied the danger stirring beneath. "Guess I've been resting long enough anyway." He stepped off the ledge, dropping the considerable height to the ground below with casual disregard. His landing created a small cloud of dust, the only evidence of his depth. Ardor as he vanished in a burst of speed that would have been invisible to ordinary eyes. The guild headquarters bustled with typical morning activity, adventurers submitting expedition proposals, exchanging dungeon drops for Valis, and boasting of their latest exploits. Amid the controlled chaos, Ainatul adjusted her glasses while reviewing a stack of incident reports from the previous day. The bespectacled half-elf paused at one particular entry, her brow furrowing with concern. "Unusual monster behavior on the 10th floor, she murmured, scanning the details. "Third such report this week." Her colleague Misha leaned over her shoulder. "The management's getting worried. There's talk of restricting access to certain levels." "That would cause an uproar," Aina replied, "remember the last time the guild had attempted such restrictions, especially among the more powerful familias." Their conversation halted as the building shuddered slightly, causing conversation to momentarily cease before resuming with nervous undertones. "What was that?" Misha whispered, gripping the edge of the desk. Aina's response died on her lips as the main doors swung open, admitting a figure that seemed oddly familiar, though she couldn't immediately place why. Tall and lean, with an air of casual confidence that drew glances without seeming to invite them. His unusual attire, neither adventurer's gear nor merchant's garb, marked him as an outlier in Orario's fashion-conscious society. The stranger approached her counter directly, ignoring the proper queuing system. Before Aina could protest, she found herself looking into the most piercing blue eyes she had ever encountered, ancient eyes in a youthful face. "The dungeon's seal is fracturing," he stated without preamble, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "You need to clear the lower levels immediately." Aina blinked, her guild training kicking in despite her surprise. "Sir, if you have concerns about dungeon conditions, there's a proper reporting procedure." "Ainatul," he interrupted, causing her to start at his knowledge of her name. "I respect the guild's protocols, but there isn't time. Contact Oranos. Tell him the sage is here, and that the boundary weakens." She stared at him, recognition slowly dawning. Stories whispered among senior guild members, ancient records locked in the restricted archives. References in the oldest texts about Orario's founding. She began, but he was already turning away. "I'll be in the dungeon," he said simply. "Keep people above the 15th floor if you value their lives." He departed as suddenly as he had arrived, leaving Aina frozen in shock. She snapped to attention only when Misha touched her arm. "Who was that?" her colleague asked, eyes wide with curiosity. Aina swallowed hard. "I need to speak with the guild director. Immediately." Bel Crenel knew he was in trouble the moment the tremor caused loose stones to cascade from the dungeon ceiling. The young white-haired adventurer had ventured deeper than his goddess would approve, eager to prove himself worthy of her faith in him. Now, separated from his party and facing a horde of unusually aggressive goblins, his rookie mistake was painfully apparent. "Come on," he muttered, gripping his small blade as the monsters circled. "I can handle this." He dodged the first attacker with desperate agility, slashing across its exposed flank. Black blood splattered the stone floor, but three more creatures immediately lunged to replace their fallen comrade. Bel parried one attack, sidestepped another. But the third goblin's crude club caught him across the shoulders, sending him stumbling into the wall. Pain bloomed across his back. Bell grimaced, regaining his footing just in time to deflect another attack. He'd survived worse, but the monster's coordinated movements were unlike anything he'd encountered on this level before. They moved with unnatural synchronicity, as though guided by a single intelligence. Another tremor shook the passage, stronger than before. Several goblins lost their footing, giving Bell precious seconds to catch his breath. He needed an escape route. Needed to rejoin Lily and the others. A new monster emerged from the shadows behind the goblin pack. Bell's blood ran cold as he recognized a hellhound, a creature that shouldn't appear on this level. Its eyes glowed with malevolent intelligence, lips pulled back to reveal obsidian fangs. This wasn't merely bad luck. Something was fundamentally wrong with the dungeon today. "Goddess, give me strength," he whispered, knowing his chances of survival had just plummeted. The hellhound snarled, tensing to spring. Bell braced himself, determined to at least die fighting, when a flash of orange materialized between him and the monster pack. A man stood where empty space had been a heartbeat before, his back to Bell, facing the creatures with casual posture that nonetheless radiated absolute confidence. The stranger's voice carried an odd mixture of weariness and amusement when he spoke. "Kid, you picked a really bad day for solo exploration." Before Bell could respond, the hellhound lunged, and the world blurred. Bell's eyes struggled to process the movements that followed. The stranger seemed to flow around the monster's attack like water, one hand striking with precision that belied its casual appearance. The hellhound collapsed mid-leap, its body dissolving into ash without the stranger having visibly drawn a weapon. The goblin horde attacked en masse. The mysterious rescuer moved among them with impossible speed, each motion economical yet devastating. He wasn't fighting so much as dancing, his body weaving between attacks while delivering crazy counters that dropped monsters with single strikes. "Who?" Bell began, but fell silent as the stranger formed unfamiliar hand signs. The air crackled with energy unlike any magic Bell had witnessed before, neither the elvish chants nor the dwarven runic systems he'd observed in other adventurers. Wind style. Vacuum sphere. The compressed air bullet struck the remaining monsters, dispersing them into particulate ash. Silence fell in the corridor, broken only by Bell's ragged breathing and the distant rumble of the dungeon's depths. The stranger turned, and Bell found himself pinned by Annette-ratting blue eyes that seemed to evaluate and dismiss him in an instant. Up close, the man appeared younger than Bell had initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s, yet something in his gaze suggested vastly greater age. "You remind me of someone," the stranger said, his expression softening fractionally. "Equally reckless, equally determined." Bell straightened, wincing at his injuries. "Thank you for saving me. I've never seen anyone move like that. Are you from one of the high-rank familias?" A mysterious smile creased the whisker-marked cheeks. "Not exactly. I don't answer to any god." The absurdity of the statement momentarily distracted Bell from his situation. Everyone in Orario belonged to a familia. It was the foundation of their society, the source of an adventurer's blessing and abilities. "That's impossible," he blurted. "Without a falna, there are older powers in this world than the gods. Blessings, kid." The stranger glanced toward the deeper levels, his expression darkening. "Get back to the surface. Things are about to get complicated down here." Another tremor shook the passage, stronger than the previous ones. Small fissures appeared in the walls, and the air grew noticeably warmer. "What's happening?" Bell asked, steadying himself against the wall. "The dungeon remembers its purpose," came the cryptic reply. The stranger reached into a pouch at his hip and withdrew a small scroll, which he tossed to Bell. "If you make it to the guild, give this to Aina Tool. Now go. Your goddess would be devastated to lose you." Bell caught the scroll reflexively. "How do you know about my goddess?" The mysterious man was already walking deeper into the dungeon, toward the source of the disturbances rather than away from them. He paused without turning. Hestia was always too kind for her own good, even among the divine. "Tell her the sage sends his regards, she'll understand." With those puzzling words, the stranger vanished around a bend in the passage, leaving Bell clutching the scroll and grappling with confusion. Another tremor decided matters for him. Bell tucked the scroll securely into his pouch and began making his way upward, mind raw. Ching with questions about his enigmatic savior. Hestia paced anxiously in her modest church basement, the improvised living quarters feeling more claustrophobic than usual as she awaited Bell's return. The tremors had reached even this far from the dungeon's entrance, and the young goddess's immortal instincts recognized danger when they felt it. "Come on, Bell," she murmured, clutching her hands before her chest. Her divine senses strained for any hint of her child's condition, but the connection offered only the reassurance that he still lived. A knock at the church's main door interrupted her worried vigil. Hestia hurried up the stairs, hoping against hope to find Bell. Instead, she discovered a familiar face she hadn't seen in centuries. "Hello, Hestia," Naruto said softly, his expression unreadable. "It's been a while." The petite goddess froze, emotions warring across her expressive features: shock, joy, anger, relief. She settled on indignation, crossing her arms beneath her ample chest. 342 years is more than a while, you inconsiderate sage. She finally exploded. "You vanished without a word." Naruto had the grace to look abashed, 1H, and rubbing the back of his neck in a gesture so familiar it made Hestia's heart ache with nostalgia. "I needed some time alone," he offered lamely. "Some time," Hestia sputtered. "Mortals have entire lifespans in the time you've been alone." Her anger deflated as quickly as it had risen, replaced by genuine concern as she noted the tension in his shoulders, the alertness in his posture. "You're not here for a social visit, are you?" "No." Naruto stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his gaze sweeping the humble church. "The seal is breaking down, Hestia. I've felt the warning signs for weeks. But today's tremors confirm it. Something's coming through." The goddess paled, her diminutive form suddenly seeming smaller. "But the countermeasures were designed to last millennia, not eternity." Naruto moved to the stained glass window depicting divine figures. His finger traced the barely discernible ninth figure half hidden among the pantheon representation, a homage to his role in Orario's founding that few would recognize. "I need access to the keystone." Hestia bit her lip. "After all this time, you appear suddenly and immediately ask for one of the most dangerous artifacts in our possession." Her blue eyes narrowed suspiciously. "How do I know you're really him? The sage has been gone so long. Some believe he never existed at all." A sad smile crossed Naruto's features. He raised his hand, palm outward, and channeled a precise mixture of chakra and natural energy. The air before him shimmered, condensing into a swirling sphere of vibrant blue energy shot through with golden threads, the Rasengan, modified to incorporate the divine essence that permeated this world. "Is that proof enough, Lady of the Hearth?" he asked quietly, using her oldest title. Hestia's expression softened. No one else could produce that particular energy signature, a blend of chakra techniques from Naruto's original world and the divine power native to her own. "You look exactly the same," she whispered, approaching him with hesitant steps. "While I've watched mortals live and die, friends fade to memory, you remain unchanged." Naruto allowed the Rasengan to dissipate, his eyes reflecting ancient sorrow. "Not unchanged, Hestia, just continuing." The goddess reached out, her small hand resting against his chest where she knew the crystal necklace lay beneath his clothing. "Bell met you, didn't he? In the dungeon. I felt your energies intersect briefly." "Sharp as ever," Naruto acknowledged. "He reminds me of myself, before everything changed. He's my only familia member," Hestia admitted. "The others," she trailed off, not needing to explain how mortal lifespans affected divine familia over centuries. Another tremor rattled the church, stronger than the previous ones. Dust sifted down from the ceiling beams. "We don't have much time," Naruto said, urgency entering his voice. "The keystone, Hestia." The goddess straightened, her divine dignity asserting itself despite her youthful appearance. "I'll need to consult with Oranos. The keystone has been secured beneath Babel since you left." "I suspected as much." Naruto closed his eyes briefly. "I've already sent a message to the guild. Oranos will understand what's happening. He helped me create the seals in the first place." Hestia studied him, her immortal perspective, allowing her to see beyond his physical appearance to the weary soul beneath. "You knew this day would come, didn't you?" That's why you withdrew from Orario, from everyone who, she caught herself. But the unspoken sentiment hung in the air between them. Naruto turned toward the door. I hope to be wrong. Wait, Hestia called as he prepared to leave. At least tell me what we're facing. What's trying to come through? The sage paused, his profile silhouetted against the light streaming through the open doorway. Something that shouldn't exist in this world. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. Something from mine. Deep beneath Babel Tower, in a chamber unknown to all but a handful of Orario's oldest inhabitants, Oranos, the god who had sacrificed his return to heaven maintained the dungeon's stability, opened ancient eyes at the approach of familiar footsteps. I wondered when you would return, the elder god intoned, not bothering to turn as Naruto entered the sanctum. The tremors speak of your failure. Not failure, Naruto corrected, stepping into the circle of pale blue light emanating from the complex array inscribed on the chamber floor. Delayed success at best. Nothing lasts forever, Oranos. Not even my seals. The ancient god finally turned, his weathered features betraying rare surprise at Naruto's unchanged appearance. The centuries have been kind to you, sage. Physically, perhaps. Naruto approached the central dais where a crystalline structure pulsed with rhythmic energy, the heart of the system that regulated the dungeon's manifestation and the flow of divine energy throughout Orario. The keystone is deteriorating. Oranos nodded gravely. Its resonance has been fluctuating for nearly a decade. I have maintained stability as best I could. But without your knowledge of the original sealing techniques. Naruto knelt before the crystal, his trained senses analyzing the complex energy patterns flowing within. The keystone, a fusion of technologies and magics from multiple worlds, had been his masterwork, a solution to contain the dimensional rift that had formed when he'd first arrived in this reality. The dungeon was never meant to be a proving ground for adventurers, he murmured, remembering those early days when the gods had first descended, fascinated by the mortals of this realm. It was a containment system, designed to channel and neutralize interdimensional energies. A purpose long forgotten by most, Oranos agreed. Even among the gods, few remember the truth. They see only the game, the monsters, the challenges, the entertainment of watching mortals struggle and grow. Naruto's hands formed a complex series of seals, channeling diagnostic energy into the crystal. The patterns within shifted, revealing hairline fractures in the internal structure. Worse than I thought, he said grimly. The barrier between dimensions is thinning. That's why the monsters are behaving strangely. They're being influenced by energies from the other side. Can it be repaired? Oranos asked, the fate of Orario hanging on the question. Naruto's expression grew distant, memories of another lifetime's acing, of sealing techniques learned from Jiraiya, from the fourth Hokage's legacy, from the combined knowledge of nine-tailed beasts. In this world, he had adapted those techniques, integrating them with divine energy principles to create something entirely new. Not repaired, he finally answered. But rebuilt, perhaps. I'll need components. Rare materials from the deepest levels, divine essence freely given, and... He hesitated. A focus object with connections to both realms. Oranos' ancient eyes narrowed. You still possess such an object. It wasn't a question, and Naruto didn't bother denying it. The crystal necklace he wore, recreated from memory after the original was lost, contained trace remnants of his homeworld's energy patterns. I'll need help, Naruto admitted, rising to his feet. I can't manage this alone. Not anymore. The admission clearly surprised Oranos, who had witnessed the sage's stubborn self-reliance over the millennia. The gods will not easily agree to cooperation. They have grown comfortable in their games and hierarchies. I'm not talking about the gods. Naruto's expression hardened. I need skilled mortals, adventurers who can retrieve the materials I need from the deepest levels. And, he sighed, knowing what he was about to suggest would cause ripples throughout Orario's delicate power structure. I need to establish my own familia. Oranos stared at him for a long moment. You are neither god nor mortal, sage. The system wasn't designed for someone like you to bestow blessings. The system, Naruto reminded him with a hint of his old mischievous smile, was largely designed by me. There are workarounds. Another tremor shook the chamber, stronger than any previous. Dust and small stone fragments showered from the ancient ceiling. Time grows short. Oranos observed unnecessarily. Do what you must, but understand that after centuries of absence, your reappearance will not be universally welcomed. Some gods have invested heavily in the current power structure. Let them complain, Naruto replied, moving toward the exit. Existence takes precedence over divine entertainment. As he reached the doorway, Oranos spoke again. His tone uncharacteristically hesitant. She felt your return, you know. The moment you used your power in the dungeon. Naruto paused, not needing clarification on which Oranos meant. I expected as much. She never stopped watching for you, the elder god continued. Even when others forgot or lost interest. A complex emotion flickered across Naruto's features, something between resignation and an ancient banked fire. Some connections transcend common sense, he said quietly. That doesn't make them healthy. He departed without further comment, leaving Oranos contemplating the damaged keystone and the complications that the sage's return would inevitably bring to Orario's fragile equilibrium. Freya stood at the highest window of Babel Tower, her real beauty unmarred by the passage of centuries. To mortal eyes, she appeared the epitome of divine perfection, flawless skin, silver hair cascading like moonlight, eyes that shifted between mesmerizing colors depending on her mood. Few could meet her gaze without becoming hopelessly enthralled. But the goddess of beauty paid no attention to the countless souls she could command with a mere glance. Her focus remained fixed on the distant figure emerging from Babel's hidden entrance, a presence she had sensed hours earlier when a burst of familiar energy had rippled through Orario's magical fabric. He's returned, she whispered, her melodic voice carrying emotions incomprehensible to mortal understanding. Behind her, Otar, her most loyal follower and the only level 7 adventurer in Orario, maintained respectful silence. He had served his goddess long enough to recognize when she spoke to herself rather than requiring response. Freya pressed her palm against the cool glass, her divine senses reaching out to taste the unique energy signature that had haunted her thoughts for centuries. Unlike normal souls that appeared to her as colored lights of varying intensity, his had always knifed as something else entirely. A swirling vortex of golden radiance shot through with crimson threads, constantly shifting yet fundamentally unchanged since she'd first encountered him. The only soul she couldn't possess with her charm. The only being who had ever looked at her with neither worship nor fear, but simple recognition. My lady, Otar finally spoke, his deep voice carefully neutral, shall I arrange a meeting? Freya's lips curved in a smile that would have stopped mortal hearts. No, my dear Otar. He'll come to me when he's ready. Her fingertip traced a pattern on the window glass. He always does. Eventually. The Borman warrior inclined his head, knowing better than to question his goddess's certainty. In all the years he had served her, only the mysterious Ge had inspired this particular mixture of obsession, respect, and something he hesitated to name in the normally capricious deity. Another tremor shook the tower, stronger than the previous disturbances. Freya's expression grew momentarily serious. The dungeon awakens to its original purpose, she murmured. How interesting that he returns precisely when needed. Her smile returned, edged with something predatory. Almost as though someone has been manipulating events. Otar tensed slightly. Do you suspect divine interference, Lady Freya? The gods play their little games, she replied dismissively. But few understand what truly lies beneath Orario. Her gaze returned to the distant figure, who had paused to look directly up at her window, impossible though it should have been for him to know precisely where she stood. He knows I'm watching. He always knows. The goddess turned from the window, her expression unreadable even to her most devoted follower. Prepare the familia for expedition, Otar. I suspect we'll soon be venturing deeper into the dungeon than ever before. As you wish, my lady. As her captain departed to carry out her instructions, Freya returned her attention to the window, but the subject of her observation had already vanished, leaving her with only the lingering sensation of his distinctive energy signature and memories spanning centuries. Welcome back, sage, she whispered to the empty air. This time, I won't let you disappear so easily. Night fell over Orario, but the city's normally vibrant evening atmosphere had been replaced by tense anticipation. Word had spread quickly, access to the dungeon restricted below the 15th floor, guild officials moving with unusual urgency, gods summoned to an emergency council at Babel Tower. Rumors flourished in the taverns and marketplaces, growing more outlandish with each retelling. Naruto ignored the speculative glances as he made his way through the hostess of fertility, a tavern favored by adventurers of various familias. He had changed into less conspicuous clothing, though nothing could fully disguise the distinctive whisker marks or the aura of contained power that accompanied him. He selected a corner table, positioning himself to observe both the main entrance and the kitchen access. Mamma Mia, the tavern's proprietress, approached his table personally, a rare hoe. Nor that caused nearby patrons to exchange curious glances. The imposing woman placed a bottle of sake and a single cup before him without being asked. "Been keeping this for a special occasion," she stated gruffly. "Figured the end of the world qualifies." Naruto's lips quirked in appreciation of her directness. "The world's not ending yet, Mia. But it might, She planted her hands on her hips, studying him with narrowed eyes. "You don't show your face for centuries, then suddenly appear on the day the dungeon starts throwing tantrums. Coincidence isn't your style, sage." "You remember me," he observed, pouring a measure of the excellent sake. "Some of us don't have the luxury of divine memory, but we manage." Her expression softened fractionally. "You helped my grandmother once. Back when the North District was still under construction. Family stories get passed down." Naruto nodded, appreciating the reminder of mortal continuity despite his own unchanging existence. He iced the cup in silent toast to her ancestry before taking a measured sip. "You're going to cause quite a stir," Mia commented, glancing toward the tavern entrance where a familiar white-haired adventurer had just appeared. Accompanied by a diminutive goddess in a white dress. "Your past has a way of finding you." She retreated to her usual post as Hestia spotted Naruto and hurried over, pulling a bewildered Belle Crenelle in her wake. "I should have known you'd choose this place," the goddess declared, sliding into the seat opposite him without invitation. "You always did prefer establishments with character over refinement." Belle remained standing, clearly unsure of proper etiquette when meeting the mysterious figure who had saved his life earlier that day. Naruto gestured to the empty chair. "Sit, Belle Crenelle. Your goddess and I have history, but that doesn't mean formality is necessary." The young adventurer complied, his crimson eyes studying Naruto with undisguised curiosity. "You're really the sage, the one from the old stories." "Some of them," Naruto replied cryptically, pouring sake for Hestia but not Belle, a subtle acknowledgement of the young man's age that the goddess noted with approval. "Though I suspect the stories have grown considerably in my absence." "They say you helped create the dungeon," Belle continued eagerly. "That you taught the gods how to bestow fauna on mortals. That you once fought an entire army of Violas single-handed, that." "Stories exaggerate," Naruto interrupted gently. "But yes, I've been in Orario since its founding, and I had and in establishing some of its fundamental systems." Hestia sipped her sake, watching the exchange with thoughtful eyes. "Belle, the sage was there when we gods first descended to the mortal realm. He understood things about this world that even we didn't, how its energies flowed, how divine and mortal essence could interact." "But if you're that old," Belle said with youthful directness, "what exactly are you?" "You're not a god, but no mortal lives for centuries." "A fair question," Naruto acknowledged, his expression growing distant. "I came from elsewhere. Another world with different rules, different powers. The transition changed me." He flexed his hand absently, watching the play of light across his skin. "I don't age, don't sicken, don't die easily. A curse or blessing, depending on perspective." Belle leaned forward, entranced by the notion. "Another world, with different gods, with different everything," Naruto confirmed. "My arrival created a disturbance, a thinning between dimensions that manifested as what you now call the dungeon. The gods, curious about this new phenomenon, investigated. Eventually, they became fascinated with mortal lives and decided to remain." Hestia cleared her throat pointedly. "You're simplifying millennia of history, sage." Naruto inclined his head in acknowledgement. "The full story would take weeks to tell, and we don't have that luxury." His expression sobered. "The dungeon tremors are accelerating. The barrier between dimensions is weakening, which means..." The tavern door burst open, admitting a harried-looking guild officia. Who scanned the room before approaching their table with obvious relief. Sage, the man said breathlessly, bowing low. Lord Oranos requests your immediate presence. The situation has deteriorated. Naruto was on his feet in an instant, his casual demeanor replaced by focused intensity. How bad? The 18th floor has completely destabilized. Monsters are exhibiting unprecedented behaviors. And there are reports of spatial distortions affecting adventurers' abilities. Hestia rose as well, her divine authority asserting itself despite her childlike appearance. Bell and I will accompany you. My child may be young, but his potential exceeds his experience. Naruto studied Bell thoughtfully, seeing beyond the awkward young man to something deeper, a familiar determination, and innate heroism that resonated with memories of his own youth. For a moment, he seemed to be looking at a ghost from his past, another young man with dreams larger than his capabilities but with the heart to grow into them. Very well, he agreed, dropping payment on the table. But stay close and follow instructions exactly. Where we're going, divine status offers limited protection. As they exited the tavern, Bell mustered the courage to ask the question that had been bothering him since their earlier encounter. Sir, Sage, why did you save me in the dungeon today? Of all the adventurers who might have been in trouble, Naruto's pace didn't slow, but something in his expression softened momentarily. Because you fight for the right reasons, Bell Crenel. Not for fame or wealth or even power itself, but to become worthy of those who believe in you. His voice dropped so low that Bell barely caught the next words. I recognized that particular dream. Before Bell could respond, the night sky above Babel Tower erupted with brilliant light, a column of energy surging upward from the dungeon's depths, shattering the peaceful evening with its ominous radiance. It's beginning, Naruto said grimly, his pace increasing to a run. The seal is breaking. As they raced toward the tower, none of them noticed the slender figure observing from a nearby rooftop, silver hair gleaming in the unnatural light. Otherworldly beauty unmarred by concern as she watched the sage sprinting toward the danger rather than away. Freya's lips curved into a smile of anticipation as she whispered into the chaos-tinged night. Now the real game begins. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2, Whispers of Divinity. The Babel Tower's lowest accessible level pulsed with chaotic energy as Naruto led their small group through corridors normally restricted to all but the highest guild officials. Bell struggled to maintain his composure, overwhelmed by both the company he kept and the oppressive atmosphere that grew heavier with each descending step. Ancient magic saturated the air, leaving a metallic tang on his tongue and raising the fine hairs on his arms. The foundations are destabilizing, Naruto observed, his fingers trailing along symbols etched into the corridor walls, markings Bell had never noticed during his previous expeditions. These containment arrays are barely functioning. Oranos awaited them in a circular chamber dominated by a massive crystalline structure rising from the floor like a jagged spine. The elder god acknowledged their arrival with a grave nod, his ancient eyes lingering on Bell with momentary curiosity before addressing Naruto. The 18th floor has been evacuated, he reported. Though not without casualties. 4 adventurers lost, 3 more severely injured. The spatial distortions are expanding upward. Hestia moved to examine the pulsating crystal. The keystone's harmonic frequency is completely destabilized. I haven't felt disruption like this since my arrival, Naruto finished, kneeling to place both palms against the chamber floor. He closed his eyes, extending his senses downward through layer upon layer of ancient stone. G's pushing against the boundary, something with intelligence and purpose. Bell watched in fascination as visible energy, neither quite magical energy as he understood it, nor divine power as he'd wit. Nest from the gods, flowed from Naruto's hands into the floor. The stone briefly illuminated with complex patterns that reminded Bell of the descriptions he'd read of ancient magical scripts. As that Falna, he whispered to Hestia. The goddess shook her head. Something older. The sage's power comes from within, not from divine blessing. Her expression softened with an emotion Bell couldn't quite identify. It's why the gods found him so fascinating when we first descended. He was unexpected. Naruto rose fluidly, his expression grim. The original seal is fracturing along 3 distinct fault lines. If they connect, we'll have a complete boundary collapse. Can it be repaired? Oranos asked. Temporarily stabilized, perhaps, but full repair will require components from the deepest levels. Naruto turned to Bell, evaluating the young adventurer with penetrating intensity. How deep have you ventured, Bell Crenel? 13th floor, sir, Bell admitted, suddenly conscious of his relative inexperience. To his surprise, Naruto nodded approvingly. Respectable progress for your time as an adventurer. Your instincts are good, you survived an encounter that should have overwhelmed your current capabilities. Bell straightened unconsciously under the praise, a reaction that didn't escape Hestia's notice. She frowned slightly, recognizing the same pattern she'd seen less times over centuries, mortals instinctively responding to the sage's natural authority, drawn to his charisma despite themselves. He's not ready for deeper levels, she interjected protectively. Especially not with the current instability. None of us is ready for what's coming, Naruto countered gently. But choices narrowed the moment the tremors began. He addressed Oranos again. I need a small expedition team, skilled adventurers with specific capabilities. Light, agile fighters who can adapt to changing conditions. A mage with spatial manipulation expertise. Someone with ancient language proficiency. The elder god considered. Assembling such a team across familias will create political complications. The gods have grown territorial about their champions. Politics is a luxury we can't afford. Naruto replied, his tone hardening. If the boundary collapses completely, there won't be familias to squabble over. A new tremor shook the chamber, stronger than previous ones. Small fragments of stone rained from the ceiling, and the crystal keystone emitted a discordant hum that set teeth on edge. We need to move quickly, Naruto decided. I'll descend immediately, to establish temporary stabilization fields at the fault points. Meanwhile, Oranos will assemble the expedition team for the permanent repair components. He turned to Hestia. Lady of the Hearth, why? Our presence would be valuable. Your domain includes stability and foundations. The diminutive goddess nodded, though Bell noticed her apprehension. My power is limited in the dungeon depths. Your insight matters more than your power. Naruto assured her. You perceive patterns others miss. He shifted attention to Bell, who straightened instinctively. Bell Crenel, you have a choice. This expedition exceeds your experience level. But your potential. He paused, studying the young adventurer with that same penetrating gaze. Your growth rate is extraordinary. Something I haven't seen since. He stopped himself. The journey will be dangerous, but educational. Bell didn't hesitate. I'll go. Hestia opened her mouth to protest, then sighed in resignation. So like your predecessors, she murmured. Though whether she meant Bell's previous familia members or someone else entirely wasn't clear. Then we leave immediately, Naruto concluded. The boundary won't wait for ideal preparation. The descent through Babel Tower's hidden access passages circumvented the usual dungeon pathways, allowing their small group to reach the 14th floor with surprising speed. Bell marveled at the efficiency of their progress. Naruto moved with absolute certainty through twisting corridors and concealed doorways that shouldn't have existed according to any map Bell had studied. The passages weren't in the guild records, he observed when they paused briefly on the 15th floor. They wouldn't be, Naruto replied, checking a particular wall marking that pulsed faintly under his touch. Their maintenance routes, created during the original dungeon stabilization. The guild knows of some, but not all. A ghost of a smile crossed his features. I've always believed in backup plans. Hestia snorted delicately. What he means is he's always enjoyed having secret ways to disappear when responsibilities became inconvenient. The barb carried more history than Bell could decipher. But Naruto's expression suggested a complex shared past. The sage merely inclined his head in acknowledgement before continuing their descent. The atmosphere changed noticeably as they passed the 17th floor threshold. The air grew thicker, carrying an electrical charge that made speech uncomfortable. Strange luminescence pulsed through the stone walls in erratic patterns, and occasionally the passage ahead seemed to ripple like disturbed water. Spatial distortions, Naruto explained, extending one hand to manipulate the apparent visual disruption. Reality thins near the fault lines. Step exactly where I step. Bell complied, fighting uncharacteristic vertigo as they navigated what appeared to be normal corridor one moment, then a bewildering multi-dimensional space the next. Twice he nearly lost his footing when the floor seemed to shift perspective beneath him. They emerged onto the 18th floor, normally a sanctuary level with its own ecosystem and peaceful qualities. Belle gasped at the transformation. The once verdant cavern now resembled a battlefield. Massive crystal formations erupted from the earth at irregular intervals, glowing with unsettling inner light. The natural ceiling had developed cracks through which energy poured like inverted lightning, striking the ground to form smoldering impact craters. The under-resort has been evacuated, Naruto asked, referring to the small settlement normally occupying this level. Hours ago, Hestia confirmed, her divine senses clearly troubled by what they perceived. Though I sense several CES remaining, likely adventurers who were deeper when the evacuation order came. Belle's hand unconsciously moved to his small blade's hilt. Monsters. Not exactly, Naruto replied, his eyes narrow, wed at something beyond normal visual perception. The 18th floor's native creatures fled when the distortions began. What remains is something else. He turned to Belle. Draw your weapon, but attack only on my command. What we'll encounter may not respond to conventional combat. They moved cautiously across the transformed landscape, weaving between crystal formations that seemed to track their movement. Belle noticed Naruto occasionally pausing to place small paper tags inscribed with complex symbols at specific locations, some attached to crystal growths, others pressed into the ground itself. Stabilization markers, Hestia explained, noticing Belle's curiosity. They help reinforce reality against the distortions. Naruto stopped abruptly, raising one hand in warning. Ahead, the air shimmered like heat rising from sun-baked stone, but with prismatic colors that hurt the eyes. Within the distortion, shapes moved with disturbing fluidity, neither quite solid nor entirely gaseous. Boundary manifestations, the sage murmured, the first sign of crossover. Before Belle could ask for clarification, one of the shapes surged forward with startling speed. It resembled a wolf in basic outline, but its substance continuously shifted between states of matter, one moment seemingly solid, the next dissolving into vapor, then reforming with crystalline properties. Most disturbing were its eyes, multifaceted like insect organs, yet glowing with unmistakable intelligence. Don't move, Naruto instructed calmly as the creature circled them, its movements leaving trails of distorted reality. 3 more entities emerged from the shimmering air, each different in form but sharing the same unsettling property of unstable materialization. One resembled an elongated humanoid with too many joints in its limbs. Another seemed avian but with geometric patterns replacing feathers. The third defied easy categorization, its form continually reorganizing into new configurations. What are they? Belle whispered, fighting his instinct to assume a defensive stance. Scouts, Naruto replied, sensory extensions from across the boundary. They're tasting this reality, assessing its properties. Hestia pressed closer to Belle, her divine presence offering small comfort against the wrongness emanating from the entities. They feel like no spirits I've encountered in any realm. The wolf-like manifestation abruptly howled, a sound that seemed to vibrate through multiple frequencies simultaneously, painful to human hearing. The other entities responded with their own disco. Ardent emissions before all 4 converged on a point 20 paces distant. The air there fractured visibly, splitting open like torn fabric to reveal swirling darkness beyond. They're creating a breach, Naruto said, his casual demeanor vanishing. His hands formed unfamiliar signs in rapid sequence. Hestia, shield Belle. This will be unpleasant. Energy surged around the sage's form, vibrant blue. E-power laced with golden threads that coalesced into visible chains extending from his body. The chains shot forward with impossible speed, wrapping around the forming breach and the entities surrounding it. Adamantine sealing chains, Naruto intoned, his voice resonating with power that Belle felt in his bones. The entities shrieked in that same reality-distorting frequency as the chains constricted, forcing the breach to collapse in upon itself. The wolf creature lunged at Naruto, its form blurring with speed, only to meet the sage's palm thrust directly into what passed for its chest. The contact produced a thunderclap of displaced air as seal markings spread from Naruto's hand across the creature's form, causing it to dissolve into particles that winked out of existence. The remaining entities attacked simultaneously. Belle, despite Hestia's restraining hand, drew his blade and moved to intercept the avian manifestation as it dove toward Naruto's exposed flank. His strike passed harmlessly through its shifting form, but succeeded in diverting its attack. Bell! Hestia cried in alarm, but Naruto was already responding. The sage moved with fluid grace that defied Bell's ability to track. Appearing beside the young adventurer in an instant, his hand clamped onto Bell's shoulder, and Bell felt a surge of foreign energy flowing into his body, warm, powerful, and somehow familiar despite its alienness. Channel it through your weapon, Naruto instructed quickly. Visualize it extending your blade's reach. Instinctively understanding, Bell focused on the strange energy, directing it into his short sword. The blade glowed with blue-gold light, extending its effective length by nearly a foot of pure energy. When the avian entity circled back for another attack, Bell's enhanced weapon sliced cleanly through its form, causing it to emit a high-pitched keening before collapsing into dissolving fragments. Meanwhile, Naruto dispatched the remaining manifestations with precise applications of sealing techniques, each entity requiring a slightly different approach, suggesting he was analyzing and adapting to their specific properties in real time. When the final creature dissolved, he quickly moved to the collapsed breach point, reinforcing the area with additional sealing tags. "You fought well," he told Bell, genuine approval in his voice. Most first-timers freeze when confronting boundary manifestations. Their wrongness overwhelms normal combat instincts. Bell stared at his weapon, now returned to normal. "What was that energy you shared with me?" "Chakra," Naruto replied, "modified to interact with this world's magical properties. Similar to what gods channel into fauna, but drawn from internal rather than external sources." "Could I learn to generate it myself?" Bell asked eagerly. Naruto's expression grew contemplative. "Perhaps. You adapted to the foreign energy remarkably quickly. Another lifetime, I might have." He stopped himself. "Another time, perhaps. For now, we have more immediate concerns." Hestia approached, her divine features showing a mixture of relief and exasperation. "That was foolishly brave, Bell. Those weren't monsters you could understand through normal experience." "Bravery often edges toward foolishness," Naruto commented with a hint of amusement. "It's a fine line I've crossed myself more times than I care to remember." The goddess shot him a look that suggested she remembered several such occasions herself. "We should continue. That breach attempt was likely just the beginning." Naruto nodded, his expression sobering. "The first fault line should be approximately 200 meters ahead, beneath what was once called the Great Moss Garden." They resumed their cautious advance through the transformed landscape. Bell now hyper-aware of the subtle distortions in reality around them. Twice more they encountered boundary manifestations, but smaller and less organized than the first group. Naruto dispatched these with efficient application of sealing techniques, explaining aspects of the process to Bell as they proceeded. "The seals convert chaotic dimensional energy into structured patterns," he explained after neutralizing a particularly persistent manifestation. "Think of it as rewriting the local rules of reality, reinforcing our dimensional constants against outside influence." Bell absorbed the explanation with fascination, though much exceeded his current understanding. What impressed him more was Naruto's fighting style, unlike any adventurer Bell had observed. The sage didn't rely on brute strength or overwhelming magical power, but rather on precise application of specialized techniques, each perfectly calibrated to the specific threat. He fought like someone who had spent centuries refining his approach, eliminating all wasted motion and unnecessary force. They reached the Great Moss Garden, once a peaceful grotto where phosphorescent moss had carpeted stone formations in gentle blue-green light. Now the space resembled a shattered mirror, fragments of normal reality interspersed with sections where physics seemed optional at best. At the center, a vertical fissure pulsed with discordant energy. "The first fault line," Naruto confirmed grimly. Hestia's expression darkened as she sensed the energies involved. "It's worse than I expected. The boundary isn't just thinning, it's being actively eroded from the other side." Naruto nodded. "Something with knowledge and purpose." He removed his pack and began extracting specialized equipment, crystalline rods inscribed with minute sealing formulas. Small containers of what appeared to be liquid metal, and parchment covered in complex mathematical notations. "I need to establish a temporary stabilization field around the fault. It won't repair the damage, but it should prevent further deterioration while we gather the components for permanent repair." What do you need from us? Bel asked. Hestia, your divine perception can help identify the fault's harmonic frequency. I need to calibrate these stabilizers precisely. He turned to Bel. You'll be our guard. More manifestations will be drawn to our work. They'll try to prevent the stabilization. As if summoned by his words, the air around them rippled with new distortions. Bel readied his weapon, now understanding what to watch for in the shifting reality patterns. Hestia moved closer to Naruto, her small hand resting on one of the crystal rods as she extended her divine senses into the fault energies. Discordant triad, she reported. Her normal cheerfulness replaced by focused concentration. Primary resonance at what mortals would perceive as deep purple, secondary as amber oscillation, tertiary fluctuating through blue-green spectrums. Naruto nodded, his hands already adjusting the crystalline rods with minute precision. Characteristic of a Class 3 breach. Could be worse, could be better, Hestia countered with a hint of their earlier banter. Bel had little time to appreciate their efficient cooperation as the first wave of manifestations materialized from the distortion field. Unlike the scout entities they'd encountered earlier, these took more aggressive forms, predatory shapes with crystalline claws and tendrils of energy that lashed out with destructive purpose. Drawing on his recent experience, Bel focused on interposing himself between the entities and his companions, knowing his conventional attacks would prove ineffective. He dodged and deflected, using his natural agility to keep the IFE stations distracted while Naruto worked on the stabilization array. Bel, Naruto called without looking up from his work. Third pouch on my belt, extraction tokens. Use them against the larger manifestations. Maintaining his defensive movement, Bel maneuvered close enough to retrieve several small metallic discs from the indicated pouch. Each bore inscription similar to the sealing tags he'd seen Naruto deploy earlier. Acting on instinct, he flung one disc at an approaching entity that resembled a multi-limbed insectoid with a crystalline exoskeleton. The token adhered to the creature's surface, glowing with increasing intensity as the inscribed seals activated. The manifestation shuddered violently before collapsing inward, drawn into the token itself, which then fell inert to the ground. Extraction complete, Bel called in surprised triumph. Good, Naruto replied, his hands moving in complex patterns as he wove energy into the stabilization array. The tokens convert manifest energy back to potential state, essentially returning it to its native dimension. Bel continued his defensive work with growing confidence, alternating between evasive maneuvers and strategy. See deployment of extraction tokens against the stronger manifestations. Smaller entities he engaged directly with his blade, having learned to channel a small amount of his own spiritual energy through the weapon to make it effective against their semi-material forms. Behind him, Naruto and Hestia worked in coordinated tandem, the goddess monitoring fluctuations in the fault's energy signature will. Naruto continuously adjusted the stabilization field to compensate. Gradually, the chaotic energies surrounding the fault line began to organize into more structured patterns, the violent discharges diminishing in frequency and intensity. Almost there, Naruto murmured, sweat beading on his brow despite his immense stamina. Hestia, I need a divine anchor point, something only you can provide. The goddess nodded, understanding immediately. She placed both hands on the central crystalline rod, closing her eyes in concentration. Divine energy, different from magic or chakra in its fundamenta, nature, flowed from her small form into the array. Where Naruto's energy appeared as blue-gold radiance, Hestia's manifested as warm amber light shot through with hearth-red threads. Bel, Naruto called sharply. Defensive perimeter. This is the critical moment. They'll sense what we're doing. Sure enough, the manifestations redoubled their efforts, their forms growing more substantial as the drew energy from the fault line itself. Bel found himself facing entities of increasing complexity and apparent intelligence, some now employing rudimentary tactics rather than mere aggressive lunges. A particularly massive manifestation coalesced from multiple smaller entities, forming a towering humanoid shape with a crystalline core visible in its chest cavity. It moved with deliberate purpose toward the stabilization array, lesser entities flanking it like coordinated guards. We have a problem, Bel announced, interposing himself in the manifestation's path. It swung one massive limb, more energy than matter, that Bel barely evaded. His return strike, even charged with spiritual energy, merely passed through its outer layers without significant effect. Naruto glanced up from his work, assessing the situation instantly. The central core, it's a coordination nexus. Disrupt it. Bell nodded, understanding the tactical approach if not the underlying theory. He circled the massive entity, looking for an opening while dodging attacks from its flanking guards. The manifestation tracked his movement with disturbing intelligence, keeping its vulnerable core protected. Drawing on his natural agility and the unpredictable fighting style that had kept him alive in the dungeon thus far, Bell feinted toward one flank before abruptly changing direction, diving beneath a sweeping attack to roll directly beneath the massive entity. From this position, he thrust upward with his charged blade, aiming for the crystalline core visible through the creature's semi-transparent form. His weapon connected with satisfying resistance, penetrating the outer energy layers to strike the physical core directly. The manifestation emitted a frequency that threatened to rupture eardrums as fractures spread through its crystalline center. Bell rolled clear just as the entity collapsed inward, releasing a shockwave that disrupted its flanking guards long enough for him to dispatch them with extraction tokens. Well done, Naruto called, genuine admiration in his voice. Innovative approach. Bell had no time to appreciate the praise as the fault line flared with renewed energy, a last desperate surge before the stabilization field could fully establish. Manifestations poured through the weakened boundary, dozens materializing simultaneously in various states of coherence. Too many, Bell realized. Backing toward his companions. I can't. You don't have to, Naruto interrupted, rising from his completed work. Stand back. The sage stepped forward, his casual demeanor replaced by focused intensity. Energy swirled around his form. Not just the blue-gold chakra Bell had observed earlier, but something more primal, drawn from the environment itself. The air grew heavy with H-power as Naruto formed a complex sequence of hand signs, ending in a configuration Bell hadn't seen before. Sage Art. Divine Forest Emergence. The stone floor beneath the manifestations erupted as enormous roots burst upward, twisting and expanding with impossible speed. Unlike normal plant matter, these roots glowed with the same energy that surrounded Naruto, revealing their nature as physical manifestations of his power rather than actual vegetation. They ensnared the boundary entities, constricting with remorseless force while simultaneously absorbing their energy. Within seconds, the chaotic swarm of manifestations had been neutralized, either absorbed into the luminous roots or forcibly dispersed back through the fault line. The roots themselves then bent toward the fault, weaving together to form a living lattice that reinforced the stabilization array Naruto and Hestia had established. Bell stared in awe. That was an adaptation of techniques from my world, Naruto explained, returning to the stabilization array to make final adjustments, modified to work with this dimension's energy properties. Hestia watched him with an unreadable expression, something between pride, nostalgia, and another emotion entirely. You've refined that technique since I last saw you use it. The integration with natural energy is more efficient. I've had time to practice, Naruto replied simply. With the immediate threat contained, they completed the stabilization process. The fault line's chaotic emissions gradually subsided, contained by the combined power of Naruto's sealing techniques, Hestia's divine anchor, and the living energy construct maintaining the boundary. This will hold temporarily, Naruto announced, straightening with barely concealed fatigue. Days, perhaps a week at most. We need to establish similar containment at the other fault lines, then gather the components for permanent repair. Bell sheathed his weapon, observing the transformed landscape around them. Where chaos had reigned minutes before, a semblance of stability had returned to the great moss garden. The manifestations had vanished, the spatial distortions reduced to occasional ripples rather than violent tears in reality. You mentioned other fault lines, he said. Are they similar to this one? Similar in principle, different in manifestation, Naruto replied, seeking his equipment with practiced efficiency. Each represents a weakness in the dimensional boundary, but expresses uniquely based on local conditions and the nature of what presses against it from the other side. Hestia brushed invisible dust from her white dress, appearing remarkably composed despite the ordeal. The next fault line will be more difficult. It's located in an area with great historical instability, the 24th floor junction. Bell couldn't hide his surprise. That's deep into the middle levels. The guild classifies it as level 4 territory at minimum. Which is why we'll need reinforcements before proceeding further, Naruto concluded. Let's return to the surface and see what expedition Team Oranos has assembled. As they began their ascent through the safer maintenance passages, Bell found himself walking beside Hestia while Naruto ranged ahead, checking for any manifestations that might have spread to upper levels. Goddess, he ventured cautiously. You and the sage seem to have history together. Hestia's expression grew nostalgic. We do. He was present when we gods first descended to the mortal realm. A curiosity to us, neither divine nor quite mortal in the conventional sense. Her blue eyes followed Naruto's distant figure. Most gods found him entertaining, a novelty. Some saw him as a potential toy or pawn. A few recognized something more significant. And you? Bell asked, sensing deeper currents beneath her reminiscence. I saw someone who understood what home means, she said softly. The gods descended out of boredom, seeking entertainment among mortals. Naruto was here by accident, stranded between worlds. We both knew what it meant to be displaced, to seek belonging. She smiled faintly. He helped me establish my first familia. Taught me to understand mortal needs and perspectives beyond mere divine amusement. Bell absorbed this, connecting it to the comfortable familiarity he'd observed between them despite apparent centuries of separation. And then he disappeared. Hestia's expression clouded. The sage has a pattern. He involves himself deeply, forms connections, then withdraws when those connections grow too intense or when memories become too painful. Her voice dropped. Immortality is harder on those who care deeply. Before Bell could pursue this intriguing insight further, Naruto rejoined them, his expression alert. We have company ahead, not manifestations. Adventurers, descending despite the restrictions. They rounded a corner to find themselves facing a small expedition party, 5. Adventurers equipped for deep-level exploration. At their center stood a tall elven woman whose striking features combined classical elven beauty with uncharacteristic intensity. Unlike most of her Ace who favored traditional robes or light armor, she wore practical expedition gear adapted for magical research. Multiple pouches containing arcane components, specialized instruments hanging from her belt, and a staff of unusual design strapped across her back. Sage, she greeted Naruto directly, ignoring protocol that would normally prioritize the goddess present. Fascinating energy signatures emanating from the lower levels. Unprecedented harmonic disturbances in the dungeon's fundamental matrix. Naruto's expression shifted from alertness to resigned familiarity. Lyriel Silverbrook, I might have known you'd ignore safety restrictions for research opportunities. The elf inclined her head slightly, silver-white hair cascading forward with the movement. Knowledge waits for no one, not even for guild proclamations. Her piercing green eyes shifted to Bell, assessing him with analytical precision. This one has been exposed to dimensional boundary energies recently. Fascinate. Ing resonance pattern in his spiritual core. Bell shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny, feeling rather like a specimen pinned for examination. Hestia stepped slightly in front of him, her divine presence asserting itself despite her diminutive stature. Lady Silverbrook, she acknowledged coolly. The lower levels are restricted for good reason. The boundary disturbances are not research opportunities, they're existential threats. Quote. Lyriel's attention shifted to the goddess, her expression betraying the briefest flicker of surprise at being addressed directly by a divine being. Lady Hestia, an unexpected pleasure. She recovered quickly, gesturing to the instruments strapped to her belt. My research could prove valuable in understanding the current phenomena. I've been studying dungeon energy patterns for decades, documenting anomalies and correlating them with historical records. Naruto considered her for a moment before nodding. Your expertise would be useful, particularly for analyzing the second fault line. I assume you brought your specialized detection equipment. The elf straightened slightly, clearly pleased at the recognition of her capabilities. Naturally, including the modified thaumaturgic resonator you once critiqued as theoretically sound but practically cumbersome. A hint of challenge entered her tone. I've refined it considerably since then. I look forward to seeing the improvements, Naruto replied diplomatically. However, your companions should return to the surface. The deeper levels are no place for conventional adventurers currently. Lyriel's expedition team, a mixture of elves and humans wearing the insignia of her research guild, exchanged uneasy glances. Their leader, a stocky human mage, stepped forward. With respect, Sage, we're contracted to protect Lady Silverbrook during her expeditions. Guild regulations require minimum party sizes for researchers venturing beyond the upper levels. I'm familiar with guild regulations, Naruto responded, having helped draft the original versions. This silenced the man effectively. Lady Silverbrook will be under my protection, which I suspect exceeds the security parameters of your contract. The elven researcher nodded to her team. Return to our base camp and inform the guild of my revised expedition status. Document the energy readings we've collected thus far. ND prepare the specialized equipment for my return. Though clearly reluctant, the team complied, recognizing the authority Naruto projected without obvious effort. As they departed toward the upper levels, Lyriel turned her full attention back to the sage. Now, perhaps you could explain the precise nature of these fault lines you mentioned. My instruments detected 3 distinct energy anomalies at different depth levels, each with unique harmonic signatures but sharing fundamental waveform characteristics suggesting a common origin point. Belle marveled at how quickly she shifted from expedition leader to focused researcher, her analytical mind clearly prioritizing knowledge acquisition above all else. Naruto matched her technical language seamlessly, explaining aspects of the D-dimensional boundary in terms Belle could barely follow. The fault lines represent structural weaknesses in the original ceiling matrix, he elaborated, producing a small scroll from which he unfolded a complex diagram. The primary containment system was designed with redundant layers to prevent precisely this type of cascading failure, but after millennia of stability, something is actively eroding the boundary from the other side. Lyriel studied the diagram with intense focus, her finger tracing specific notations. These symbols, they're unlike any magical formula I've documented in my research. Neither elvish construction nor dwarven runic patterns. She looked up sharply. These are from your original world. Naruto nodded, rolling the scroll closed. Fuinjutsu, the sealing techniques of my homeland, adapted to work with this world's energy properties. They formed the foundation of the dungeon's containment system. The elf's eyes widened with scholarly excitement. You've never shared these formulations before. In all my research into Orario's magical origins, these patterns were merely theoretical, glimpsed in ancient fragments but never confirmed. There were good reasons for discretion. Naruto replied simply. Lyriel appeared ready to press further, but Hestia intervened. We should continue to the surface. Oranos will be assembling the expedition team, and we need to report on the first fault line's stabilization. They resumed their ascent through the maintenance passages, Lyriel falling into step beside Naruto, peppering him with technical questions about the dimensional boundary which he answered with surprising patience. Belle found himself again walking with Hestia, who watched the interaction ahead with complex emotions playing across her expressive features. They know each other well? He inquired quietly. Hestia sighed. Lyriel Silverbrook is one of the foremost magical scholars in Orario, perhaps on the continent. She's devoted considerable lifespan to understanding the fundamental principles underlying the dungeon's creation. A hint of reluctant respect entered her voice. Unlike many elven scholars who merely catalog existing knowledge, she actively pursues new understanding, sometimes at significant personal risk. And her connection to the sage, professional admiration that evolved into something more complex, Hestia replied carefully. She approached him initially seeking knowledge, one of the few researchers who had pieced together enough historical fragments to identify him as a primary source rather than mere legend. Her expression grew slightly stiff. Their intellectual compatibility is considerable. Belle detected undertones in his goddess's response that suggested more personal concerns, but before he could inquire further, they reached the upper maintenance junction where the passage rejoined conventional dungeon routes. Here, they encountered another unexpected group, Guild Officia, LS accompanying a small contingent of high-level adventurers from various familias. At their center stood a tall, well-built man with red hair and roguish features, Gareth, Belle recognized with surprise. Captain of the famous Loki familia and one of Orario's legendary adventurers. Beside him stood a diminutive figure with lavender hair and distinctive pointed ears, Findiamni, the Palom commander. whose tactical genius was renowned throughout the city. Sage, Gareth greeted Naruto with gruff respect. Orano's sent us to find you. The situation's deteriorating faster than anticipated. Finn stepped forward, his calculating gaze taking in their small party with professional assessment. 3 more spatial disturbances have manifested in the upper levels. Guild headquarters itself Experian. CED a minor breach 2 hours ago, quickly contained, but concerning given the distance from the dungeon proper. Naruto's expression darkened. The boundary weakening is accelerating. We've stabilized the first fault line, but it's a temporary measure at best. He gestured to Lyriel. Lady Silverbrook's expertise will be valuable for analyzing the spread patterns. The elven researcher was already consulting her instruments, which emitted soft, pulsing lights in various colors. Fascinating. The harmonic disturbances are propagating upward along ley lines of never documented before, almost as though they're following a predetermined path. She looked up sharply. These aren't random failures. They're systematic, targeted breaches. Intelligent direction, Naruto confirmed grimly. So, Mething on the other side knows exactly what it's doing. Bell felt a chill at the implications. Not random monster activity or natural dungeon phenomena, but purposeful intent behind the disturbances. The young adventurer suddenly understood why Naruto had emerged from centuries of seclusion to address this particular threat. Gareth stroked his beard thoughtfully. Oranos has assembled representatives from the major familias at Babel Tower. Political complications aside, the gods recognize existential threats when they manifest literally under their feet. He chuckled without humor. Nothing. Like imminent destruction to foster temporary cooperation. We should join them immediately, Hestia decided, her divine authority surfacing despite her childlike appearance. The gods will need understand what we're facing if we're to coordinate an effective response. As they prepared to ascend to the surface, Bell noticed Naruto hanging back briefly, his attention focused on something only he could perceive. The sage pressed his palm against a specific section of wall, channeling energy into the stone. Faint symbols illuminated beneath his touch, similar to those Bell had observed on the stabilization array, but simpler in configuration. Early warning system, Naruto explained, noticing Bell's observation. If the fault line destabilizes further, this will alert me immediately. You've prepared for everything, Bell commented, impressed by the foresight such preparations represented. Naruto's expression grew distant. Not everything, just the disasters I've personally witnessed or caused. The momentary vulnerability vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by his usual composed demeanor. Let's not keep the gods waiting. They tend toward dramatic overreaction when left to speculation. The council chamber atop Babel Tower hummed with divine energy and barely restrained tension. Representatives from Orario's major familias lined the circular room, their gods seated at the central table while their captains stood respectfully behind them. Bell had never witnessed such a gathering of power, mortals and immortals alike whose names featured in tavern songs and children's stories throughout the land. Loki, the trickster goddess with her perpetual squint and mischievous smile, flanked by her top adventurers including the renowned Ace Wallenstein. Hephaestos, the forge goddess, her face partially concealed behind an elaborate eye patch, her greatest crafters standing at attention behind her. Ganesha, Dionysus, Mayak, Takemikazuki, divine beings whose Ori presence seemed to alter the atmosphere of the room. Most striking was the empty chair at the table's end, deliberately left vacant but commanding attention nonetheless. The goddess to whom it belonged was conspicuously absent, though her familia captain, the imposing Borman Atar, stood behind it with impassive dignity. Oranos presided at the table's head, his ancient features grave as he acknowledged their arrival. The elder god gestured to the empty seats reserved for them, Hestia taking her place among the divine representatives while Naruto remained standing, clearly preferring not to sit at the gods' table despite the chair provided. The sage has returned to address our crisis, Oranos announced, bringing the murmured conversations to immediate silence. He brings first-hand knowledge of the boundary disturbances. All eyes turned to Naruto, divine and mortal alike studying him with varying degrees of recognition, respect, suspicion, or simple curiosity. Bell, standing uncomfortably behind Hestia's chair as her sole familia representative, felt profoundly outclassed among legendary adventurers. Loki broke the momentary silence, her perpetually squinting eyes somehow conveying sharp focus nonetheless. Well, the mysterious sage emerges from whatever rock he's been hiding under. Convenient timing, wouldn't you say? Her smile remained playful, but her tone carried clear suspicion. Centuries of absence, then you appear precisely when the dungeon starts misbehaving. Almost as though you knew it would happen. I did, Naruto acknowledged calmly, earning surprised murmurs from those present. The containment system was always designed as a long-term solution, not a permanent one. I've monitored its degradation for decades. Yet you waited until catastrophic failure began before intervening, Dionysus observed, twirling a wine goblet between his fingers. An interesting choice. Naruto's expression remained neutral. The boundary held longer than anticipated. When degradation accelerated beyond predicted parameters, I returned. Hestia straightened in her chair. The sage has already established temporary stabilization at the primary fault line, buying us time to address the larger threat. Rather than questioning his timing, perhaps we should focus on the coordinated response required. Lady Hestia speaks wisely, Hephaestus agreed, single visible eye studying Naruto with thoughtful assessment. The question isn't why the boundary fails now, but how we prevent complete collapse. Oranos nodded gravely. The sage proposes an expedition to gather specific components necessary for permanent boundary repair. This will require venturing into the deepest levels, territories few adventurers have survived exploring. A ripple of conversation spread through the chamber as gods and mortals alike considered the implications. Expeditions below the 50th floor were rare even for Orario's most powerful familias, and the current instabilities made such ventures exponentially more dangerous. What exactly are we facing? Finn Diemny asked, his tactical mind focusing on practical considerations. These boundary manifestations, described in guild reports, what are their capabilities, weaknesses, patterns of behavior? They're sensory extensions from another dimension, Naruto explained, stepping forward to activate a crystalline projection device in the table's center. It displayed three-dimensional images of various manifestations they had encountered. Not monsters in the conventional sense. They don't spawn from the dungeon itself but push through weakened points in the dimensional boundary. Their physical properties fluctuate between states of matter, making conventional weapons largely ineffective unless charged with specific energy signatures. Lyriel stepped forward, her analytical expertise contributing to the explanation. Their behavior suggests coordinated intelligence rather than instinctual aggression. They prioritize creating and expanding breaches, suggesting purposeful invasion rather than random emergence. An invasion from another dimension, Loki summarized, her smile widening with inappropriate excitement. How deliciously apocalyptic. And what exactly lies on the other side of this boundary? More of these crystalline nasties, or something worse? Naruto and Oranos exchanged a significant glance before the sage answered carefully. The boundary separates this world from multiple dimensional planes. What currently presses against it appears to originate from my home dimension. Or something adjacent to it, a realm with different fundamental laws and energies. This revelation caused considerable reaction among the assembled gods, many of whom had been present when Naruto first arrived in Orario millennia before. Divine memories, unlike mortal ones, did not fade with time. They remembered precisely the circumstances of his appearance and the subsequent creation of the dungeon's containment system. You believe something followed you, Hephaestus stated rather than asked. After all this time, or something found the pathway I inadvertently created, Naruto corrected. The dimensional tear that brought me here was sealed, not erased. It left a permanent weakness in the fabric of reality, one that has apparently been discovered from the other side. Bell Strew. GG led to comprehend the scale of what they discussed. Dimensional boundaries, invasions from other realities, these concepts exceeded his limited worldview. Yet the grave expressions on the faces of GoDs who normally approached life with casual amusement emphasized the severity of their situation. What components do you need for permanent repair? Finn asked practically, returning the discussion to immediate concerns. Naruto activated another projection, displaying a list of rare materials with their likely locations in the dungeon's depths. Crystal cores from the 59th floor caverns. Dimensional ore from the 74th floor mining veins. Spirit essence from the water sanctuary on the 65th floor. He pointed to a final item on the list. And most crucially, catalyst material from the deepest level currently accessible, the 106th floor boundary chamber. Silence fell as the adventurers processed the implications. Even Orario's strongest had rarely ventured beyond the 80th floor, and expeditions to the 100th level were the stuff of legend, attempted perhaps once a generation, rarely with survivors. Impossible, one of the guild officials stated flatly. Even without current instabilities, gathering materials from those depths would require multiple specialized expedition teams, months of preparation, unprecedented cooperation bet. Wean familias who traditionally compete rather than collaborate. We don't have months, Naruto countered simply. The temporary stabilization will hold for days at most. After that, the boundary collapse accelerates beyond our ability to contain. Loki leaned forward, her perpetual smile taking on a predatory edge. And if this boundary completely collapses, what exactly happens to our lovely little world? Dimensional merger. Lyriel answered before Naruto could. Based on the energy signatures of measured, a complete boundary failure would result in catastrophic reality overlay. 2. Incompatible dimensional frameworks attempting to occupy the same space-time coordinates. She glanced at Naruto for confirmation. Essentially, the end of this world is a coherent reality. The blue NT assessment silenced even Loki's amusement. Gods might be immortal, but their enjoyment of the mortal realm depended entirely on its continued existence. Divine beings could return to the upper world if necessary, but the mortal inhabitants of their adopted home had no such escape. Then we have no choice, Finn concluded pragmatically. We must organize the expedition teams immediately. The Palom commander turned to his goddess. Lady Loki, with your permission, I would lead our familia's contribution to this effort. Similar offers quickly followed from other familia captains. There go. DS nodding approval despite the risks involved. Bell watched with growing admiration as Orario's legendary adventurers, normally rivals competing for dungeon resources and public acclaim, united in on purpose against an existential threat. Throughout this cooperative surge, Ottar remained silent behind the empty chair, his stoic expression betraying nothing of his thoughts or his absent goddess's potential position. The Freya familia's cooperation would be valuable given their considerable strength and resources, but their goddess's absence from such a crucial meeting spoke volumes about our independent approach to divine politics. As the discussion turned to practical expedition planning, a sudden chill swept through the chamber. Conversation faltered as divine senses registered a new presence approaching, powerful, deliberate, and unmistakable in its signature. The massive doors swung open without visible assistance, admitting a single figure whose mere appearance transformed the atmosphere. Freya entered like living moonlight, her otherworldly beauty transcending conventional description. Silver hair cascaded around features so perfect they seemed almost painful to behold, her eyes shifting through colors that shouldn't naturally exist. She wore a simple white dress that somehow emphasized rather than concealed her divine form, moving with fluid grace that made even other gods appear clumsy by comparison. Most mortals present immediately averted their gaze, instinctively protecting themselves from her overwhelming charm. Bell found himself staring despite the danger, transfixed by beauty that bordered on the traumatic, until Hestia's small hand firmly turned his face away. How dramatic, Loki commented dryly, one of the few gods unaffected by her rival's entrance. Always needing to make an entrance. Aren't you, Freya? The goddess of beauty ignored the barb completely, her otherworldly gaze fixed on Naruto with singular intensity. For his part, the sage met her eyes directly, one of the very few beings, mortal or divine, who could do so without being ensnared by her charm. Sage, Freya addressed him, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated on multiple levels of perception. How many centuries has it been? 3, 4, you're looking unchanged. A smile curved her perfect lips. As am I, Lady Freya, Naruto acknowledged with a slight inclination of his head, respectful but notably lacking the awe or admiration her presence typically inspired. Your timing is impeccable as always. Is it? She replied with false innocence, gliding forward to claim her empty chair. Ottar moved silently to stand at attention behind her. I merely sensed a disturbance in Orario's fabric, something significant enough to draw you from seclusion. Naturally, my curiosity was piqued. Her gaze swept the assembled gods and mortals before returning to Naruto. I've been monitoring the boundary fluctuations myself. My familia has already ventured to the 30th floor to collect preliminary data. She produced a small crystal sphere that pulsed with captured energy patterns. Perhaps this will assist your analysis. Lyriel stepped forward despite protocol, her scholarly interest overcoming proper deference to a goddess. Energy signatures from the third quadrant. We haven't been able to access those sectors due to increasing distortions. Freya smiled indulgently at the elf's enthusiasm, though her attention remained fixed on Naruto. My children are quite accomplished at navigating dangerous territory. They could prove invaluable to your expedition plans. The implication was clear. The Freya familia's considerable resources and high-level adventurers would participate, but only under their goddess's direct conditions. Given the urgency of their situation, refusal would be impractical despite the complications her involvement inevitably introduced. Your assistance would be welcome, Naruto replied diplomatically, though B.L.L. noticed a slight tension in his posture that hadn't been present before the goddess's arrival. Freya's smile deepened with satisfaction. Excellent. Then I shall personally oversee my familia's contribution to this endeavor. She turned to Oranos. I assume you're forming specialized teams based on the different materials required. My children would be particularly suited for the catalyst retrieval from the deepest levels. Oranos nodded gravely. We were just beginning to organize the expedition structure. Your input would be valuable, Lady Freya. As the discussion resumed with this new dynamic, Bell noticed the subtle shifts in the chamber's atmosphere. Where coordination had been developing smoothly before, Freya's presence introduced an element of competition and self-interest that complicated matters. Gods who had readily offered their adventurers now added conditions and caveats, responding instinctively to the territorial marking Freya had established. Most telling was the interaction, or careful lack thereof, between Freya, Naruto, and Hestia. The goddess of beauty maintained constant awareness of Naruto's position regardless of where her attention appeared directed. Hestia, meanwhile, projected casual indifference that her tense shoulders betrayed as pretense. Naruto himself maintained professional focus on the expedition planning, though Bell occasionally cogged him watching both goddesses with an expression suggesting complicated history. The meeting concluded with preliminary teams assigned to each material objective, timelines established for their simultaneous expeditions, and coordination protocols developed for maintaining communication across the vast vertical distances involved. Bell found himself tentatively assigned to Naruto's personal team, not because of his modest capabilities, but apparently due to the sage's specific request. As the council dispersed, Freya intercepted Naruto near the chamber exit, her divine presence clearing around them as others instinctively gave the goddess wide berth. Bell remained close enough to overhear their exchange, his curiosity overcoming proper discretion. 347 years, she stated without preamble, answering his earlier non-question. Since you last walked openly in Orario. You kept count, Naruto observed, his tone carefully neutral. I keep track of what interests me. Her perfect fingers adjusted an already flawless strand of silver hair. You knew the boundary would eventually fail. That's why you withdrew, to avoid forming attachments that would complicate your inevitable return. The insight struck uncomfortably close to what Hestia had implied earlier. Naruto's expression remained unreadable, but Bell sensed the accuracy of Freya's assessment. The expedition leaves tomorrow, he replied, diplomatically avoiding her observation. Your familia's contribution is appreciated. Freya laughed softly, a sound like crystal wind chimes that caused several nearby adventurers to visibly shiver with its beauty. Still deflecting after all these centuries. Some things never change. Her otherworldly eyes studied him with an intensity that would have paralyzed most mortals. I will accompany the expedition personally. This unexpected declaration finally broke Naruto's composed facade. That would be unwise. The deeper levels will be exponential. More dangerous with the boundary fluctuations. Even gods can be harmed under such conditions. How touching, Freya responded, genuine amusement lighting her features. You're concerned for my safety. Rest assured, Sage, I've never been one to watch from a distance when something truly interests me. Her voice dropped to a register that carried meanings beyond the words themselves. And haven't you always been the most interesting thing in this realm? She turned to depart, pausing briefly to acknowledge Belle's presence with a glance that seemed to evaluate his soul itself. Something in her expression shifted, surprise, then calculation, then something more complex, before she continued on her way, Ottar falling into step behind her. Hestia appeared at Belle's side, her small hand firmly gripping his arm. Don't stare after her, she admonished quietly. Freya notices those who notice her, rarely to their benefit. She seems fixated on the sage, Belle observed cautiously. Hestia's expression darkened. Freya collects beautiful souls like mortals collect precious gems. The sage possesses the one soul she's never been able to claim despite centuries of effort. The goddess sighed heavily. Their history is complicated. Naruto rejoined them, his composed demeanor restored though a subtle tension remained in his shoulders. We should prepare for tomorrow's expedition. Belle, you'll need specialized equipment for the journey, the conventional adventurer's gear won't suffice where we're going. As they departed the council chamber, Belle found himself processing the complex dynamics he had witnessed. Beyond the existential threat of dimensional collapse lay equally intricate personal connections, particularly the clearly significant history between Naruto and the two goddesses now involved in their expedition. The young adventurer wondered privately how these ancient relationships might influence their dangerous journey into the dungeon's depths. From Hestia's protective concern to Freya's possessive interest to Lyriel's scholarly fascination, Naruto stood at the center of a complex web of connections despite his apparent preference for solitude. For the first time, Belle considered that perhaps the boundary between dimensions wasn't the only volatile force they would need to manage in the days ahead. Chapter 2 End. The End. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.